All right, there we go. As you can see on my screen, you are joining the session today. We are calling these our COC charter chats. So you join the Flint and Genesee County COC and its attempt to revise our charter. So we invite you into this chat today. As you can see, today's session, each of these chats that have been going on for several weeks has a certain theme and a certain topic for each chat. Today's chat is all about the lead agency, the homeless management information system, the collaborative applicant, and what those roles and responsibilities look like. We are pleased to have our current lead agency with us, Metro Community Development. And thank you, Tracy, the Vice President of the Community Development Department within Metro. So she'll be sitting with us today. And then we also have a consultant that the COC has contracted with, Ms. Polly Shepard. She has been working with us tirelessly through this effort. And so without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Polly, who will be walking us through this presentation today.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Angela, and all of you who have been working tirelessly with this whole process. As we start to put everything in writing, it gets more complicated, and the more we excavate, the more we discover that we don't know, or we know. So this is really a chance for all of you to provide input, to ask questions, to clarify what we think we know or what we think we don't know. So please make this interactive and helpful for yourselves and for ultimately for the community. So we have this PowerPoint that will guide us. I will take probably, our format has been for me to say what I have to say in 30 minutes. If you have questions, write them in the chat so we can capture them for ultimately making a FAQ to share with everybody in the whole general membership from all of the sessions. And then after I'm done, we'll have a chance for input and comments and questions, but I'm sure that we'll end up with some. So I still have some myself. So next slide, I guess, Angela, please, and thank you. So just a brief reminder, if you've been to other chats, you've seen the same slide. We have a work group that's been working for a very long time on this, and then at least every other week, and sometimes 4 and 5 times a week. We started last October, and you can see the times that we have presented to the general membership. We've presented regularly to the governance council, and there have always been updates every general membership meeting, but I've actually come and presented some sections. We've had surveys, we've had opportunities for people to send us questions and help us along the way. So that's where we've been, and this is where we're going. So next slide. Really, we have this really long document because we have a lot to say about what we do, because you guys do a lot. But the whole point is to communicate a structure and a process that works best for Flint and Genesee County. And we know we do some things in Flint and Genesee County that are different than the rest of the state. That doesn't make it right or wrong. We just want to do what's right for our community. So within the structure that HUD and MISTA and everybody else provides, we have some flexibility. So our goals are to get our ducks in a row, but to maximize input, to make the process as objective as possible, to use evidence in our decision making, to be collaborative, to always pay attention to community needs, to do some planning, not just put out fires, and to implement, execute our goals. We're also hoping to minimize conflicts of interest. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of programming at stake. Minimize confusion and commit to a code of conduct for all participants, whether you're a member of the COC or if you're in a committee or the governance council, or a staff member of one of the entities. We want to ensure the processes are fair, transparent, and consistent and compliant with funding requirements. But we also are trying to build in flexibility so that even if funders change or their requirements change, this charter still works and the community is still doing what its community needs. So those are our goals. So we're hoping that you will hold us to those as we look through the document. So we've proposed some changes. There's a lot that's the same that we just have taken the time to write down and try to be as clear and everybody on the same page as possible. But there are some changes. So In this case, we just clarified that the lead agency, the HMIS administrator, and the collaborative applicant may or may not be the same agency. Right now, Metro has all those roles, but they don't have to have. And in many communities, there is no such thing as a lead agency. We added an RFP, a request for proposals, that would result in a memorandum of agreement process led by the governance council, with review by the IRT, the independent review team that we talked about before, that's new for any and all contracted entities. So for the 3 that we're talking about today, as well as the HARA, as well as any other entity you might decide to contract for. We've tried to add specificity regarding the roles and responsibilities of each entity, and created an article in the charter for each one of those so that it's really clear who does what. We've also talked about a potential language change from lead agency to infrastructure organization. And it sounds like a mouthful. We would quickly say IO instead, I'm sure, as we always do, but trying to be more descriptive of what the lead agency in its role as lead agency, not collaborative applicant and not HMIS administrator, what it does. And it really is providing infrastructure for this whole thing to work. And the other new thing we did is we created designated seats and undesignated seats for the governance council. So the designated seats would be essentially permanent seats, entities that really need to always probably be at that table. We created term limits for the officers and for those who are in undesignated seats. And we've asked that the lead agency, the HMIS administrator, and the HARA, which we talked about at the last session, have a designated but non-voting seat on the governance council. So they would attend all governance council meetings, actively participate to maximize information flow and communication. So moving to the lead agency, these are some general principles. And because we have a collaborative model and we aren't a nonprofit or something that has its own structure, and we have identified a lead agency to fulfill a number of those infrastructure roles, which Metro does. The LA or the IO proactively assists the COC in meeting its mission, in that we really worked with the word proactively, and a lot of the language in the charter addresses that. So the idea is that that infrastructure organization is really thinking about the mission, not just reacting to what the general membership asks or the governance council asks, but really goes out and says, this is what we need in our community to meet their mission of reducing homelessness. So they work to increase the community's capacity, seeking additional resources to address needs. So we don't have to just have HUD funds. There are a lot of communities across the country that have all kinds of other resources, and we could be one of them. We want to ensure the community has a strategic plan that addresses the mission, that we look at it, that we use it. It's not just gathering dust on a shelf someplace. And that the IO acts like a backbone organization, basically, to lead the work, coordinate the work, and provide technical assistance. So we get into this in a little bit more detail, certainly in the charter and in the next couple slides, but those are sort of the general principles. We also see that the lead agency is responsible for monitoring COC programs and concerns. They may or may not have the responsibility and funding to be the collaborative applicant. They may or may not be the HMIS administrator. They may or may not have the responsibility and funding for coordinated entry. Right now, Metro is the benefit or the burden, I don't know which, of all of those. So we want to make sure that's flexible going forward, and we do what the community has the capacity to do at the time. So in terms of selecting the lead agency or the IO, the HUD rules say that it may be a nonprofit or a municipality. The process the charter proposes is that the general membership retains approval of all of these key decisions. So they'd be selected by the general membership, but there would be first a competitive request for proposals process. The IRT would review those proposals and make recommendations, forward those to the GC. The governance council will then review, and if they had anything to add to the recommendation or disagree with it, they would forward all of that to the general membership for a vote. So the vote remains with the general membership. Prior to all of that, the Governance Council consults with the general membership to develop a policy and procedure for selecting the lead agency, including criteria. So there is a draft RFP policy that the work group has worked on. I think it's been to the Governance Council, but it needs to be formally adopted at some point. But that will help provide the framework for this, ultimately for the memorandum of agreement, which gets signed by the COC, whoever the lead agency is in Genesee County. And the proposal is that we go through this process every 5 years, and that's consistent in every section of these contracted entities. Okay, I think that's that slide. So in terms of a little more specificity about the roles and responsibilities of the lead agency, it provides administrative functions, including meeting logistics, management of the membership. There's a lot, because the general membership makes a lot of decisions, all the key decisions, and you have had always provisions for members to be in good standing, meaning they had to attend a certain number of meetings. The charter continues that, and we had that in our first charter chat. But it's important then for the infrastructure organization to keep track of that, who's allowed to vote, so that if there's ever a desire to have a roll call vote, we know who to call on and we know who can vote. So that's a somewhat tedious but necessary task to make sure that we always know who's voting, and that all the members have signed codes of conduct, conflict of interest disclosures, et cetera. And the infrastructure organization maintains all that on a real-time, everyday basis. They also are responsible for overseeing compliance and efficiencies of any subrecipients or programs it funds. It collects and analyzes community data, prepares grant applications. It ensures strategic planning and the annual action plans, monitors and evaluates progress of those plans, works with the COC to identify gaps, barriers, potential solutions. So that's all part of that proactive work to maintain capacity in our community to do what we need to do. And it participates actively as a member of the Governance Council with a designated non-voting seat. And that would designate a single appropriate and knowledgeable representative to be on the Governance Council regularly. In addition to that, we're saying that the lead agency is responsible to the COC, reporting through the Governance Council, and there will be performance criteria and an evaluation process in the MOA. They're clearly responsible to HUD for whatever funding they get from fund and from HUD, and they participate in monitoring and reporting requirements to make sure the community doesn't lose its funding for this work. Any sanctions, again, that are required for lack of performance would be in the MOA, so both parties would know what those were. And there would be termination clauses too if the COC chooses to terminate the relationship with the lead agency, or the lead agency decides to terminate its relationship with the COC. There is now a requirement for record retention consistent with funder requirements, confidentiality policy in place, and all the other security and privacy procedures that HUD requires. And if there is going to be a transition from one agency to another, the charter requires a plan to be in place at least 30 days prior to the transition date. So clearly that decision would have to be made before that in time to make the plan. So it wouldn't happen overnight if all goes well, and it wouldn't be a big scramble. At least that's the goal. Okay, moving on to the collaborative applicant. So there's a lot of repetition, because if they're different entities, even though they're not today, but if they were in the future, we want to hold them to some of the same general principles. So first, as a community, according to HUD rules, we determine if one or more application will be submitted for HUD funds. If we're only going to submit one, then the COC has to identify a collaborative applicant to do that application process. So this is where I'm counting on all you content experts to help me if I goof this up. So The collaborative applicant, as defined by HUD, applies to HUD for planning grants on behalf of the COC, consistent with funding priorities as approved by the COC. And we went through that discussion process when we talked about the independent review team and how that works. So the collaborative applicant, in order to do that, has to collect and combine information from all the projects selected for funding and applies on behalf of the COC. The COC still has to retain its responsibilities, however, and approve the application as prepared by the collaborative applicant. They can't just blame the collaborative applicant for something. When the HUD funds are awarded, the collaborative applicant becomes the recipient and then meets the HUD requirements for recipients. So in terms of full disclosure, I want you to know that I've been going back and forth with Carrie at HUD to make sure I'm understanding this and that we have it correct. So this may still be up for discussion. Next page. Again, in terms of eligibility and selection, it's the same process that we talked about for the lead agency, nonprofit or municipality, selected in the same way, criteria and policy and procedure developed in the same way, RFP every 5 years, memorandum of agreement. Again, the collaborative applicant collects the information and to prepare that and submit it, applies for the planning funds. The COC is responsible, though, for establishing priorities for funding projects and for approving the ultimate application that gets submitted. The collaborative applicant enters into grant agreements with HUD for new awards and for renewal awards. And they ensure the operation of the projects, monitors and reports progress, ensures that individuals experiencing homelessness are involved according to the HUD regs, ensures certification from subrecipients, has fiscal controls, maintains records. The collaborative applicant is also responsible for obtaining a certificate of consistency as required by HUD. And they're required also to work in consultation with the COC and the HMIS administrator to update the charter on an annual basis at least. Switching gears to the homeless management information system. General principles are very much the same. The HMIS administrator is designated by the COC as required by HUD to operate the continuums, HMIS on its behalf. HUD requires that all communities have the capacity to collect data about homelessness. The COC has to review, revise, and approve a privacy plan, security plan, and data quality plan that the HMIS administrator develops. The COC ensures consistent participation of residents and subrecipients in the HMIS. And the COC must ensure that HMIS is administered in compliance with HUD requirements. So in selecting that HMIS administrator, the community has to make sure they have someone who has the capacity to run the system that collects and reports meaningful data and a culture to proactively share that data. So all of that information is really essential to inform the governance council, the HARA, the lead agency, everyone about what's going on in our community and are we getting the outcomes we all really want. Selection process the same. Policy and procedure creation the same, RFP every 5 years, another MOA signed by the same parties. The roles and responsibilities are administering the HMIS grant funds, developing the standards and privacy and security plans we talked about before, maintains those record retention, meets the record retention requirements, trains participating agencies, provides technical assistance, ensures that the participants have the appropriate licenses they need for the HMIS system, conducts regular HMIS agency administrator meetings, monitoring agency training and data quality, monitors participating agencies, ensures quality data and compliance with policies and standards, evaluates outcomes. 100 years ago, when we first were talking about computer systems. I remember my first gigantic portable laptop. It was garbage in, garbage out debate. So we really are counting on the HMIS to help the agencies who are putting in the data put in quality data, because not everybody is, maybe used to doing that initially. So the HMIS administrator, again, is required to work with the COC and the collaborative applicant to annually review and update the governance charter, submit reports directly to HUD, or as required by HUD, supports COC committees, governance council, and the IRT. And with the IRT, it's really essential that they are well informed. They're an independent review team, and we wanted them to be independent, but they also may not be content experts like you guys are. So they're going to need data, and good data, to base their review and recommendations on. So the HMIS is going to be essential, because that's what drives all the funding priorities in the application. And once again, we're asking that they would hold a designated non-voting seat on the governance council and name an appropriate representative. So this is the structure, just as a reminder of what all of this ends up sort of looking like. The general membership is on the top. The contracted entities are contracted to the general membership, and how many names are in there, depends on the structure you guys end up with. And we combine the work of some committees, drop down from 10 to 7 committees plus the executive. But the work remains the same, but we hope to get the same people who are doing sort of similar things and all in one committee, so that it would maybe be as efficient as possible. All right. So in summary, we clarified that these entities that we're talking about today may or may not be all the same agency. There will be an RFP and an MOA process. We're trying to get as specific as we can about the roles and responsibilities, so everybody knows who's doing what. We're talking about changing the language to be more clear, even though it's longer. And we added the designated, undesignated seats. So you can always reach me any time of the day or night, and my cell phone is on every email I send. So if you have thoughts or questions after we get done today, please tell us. We don't want to be surprised at the last minute that somebody has a major problem with something and it's really at the last minute. So help us get it right now, please. All right, I'm done. I did it in under 30 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Polly. Just as a general reminder, there is one final session left. And then, of course, we'll be continuing to have discussions at the COC meeting. We are planning to do a town hall meeting to kind of recap all of these things. But the next session is scheduled for the 12th. So that would be next Friday. And that session in our charter chats, we'll talk about performance evaluation and continuity. So please, if you get a chance, join us there. If for some reason you know someone who needed to review this content today, but they were unable to make this meeting, again, we will provide a link to our YouTube page, our newly created YouTube page, right? So follow us. I won't be cliche and say follow, share, and like, but the content is embedded there, and the intention there is that we know sometimes based on an organization and capacity, sometimes having the time and luxury to attend these meetings can be few and far between. You may need leadership in your organization to have a better understanding of how the COC is structured and function. So the PowerPoint as well as the recorded video is available. You can review that, share that as you will. And so without further ado, Polly, let's see if we got any questions in the chat.
I didn't see any, except Bill agreed with me that it's still garbage in, garbage out. Oops, wait, here's another thing. What else did Bill say?
He says, Bill, can you come off mute? You want to talk today or you want me to read?
What I said was, what was not clear yesterday And it was something that was said on the slide and in the organization chart that the HARA is a contracted entity of the COC. That was not clear yesterday when we talked about the HARA. The way the HARA was presented, housing assistance, resource agency, all of that good stuff. I hate using a lot of alphabet soup here, was the fact that they were presented as two separate functions, two separate entities versus a contractual entity. That I think needs to be very clear. And that was not clear yesterday at all. And I think there's a lot of confusion. Plus, I think we need to do a functional, what they call a functional assessment or functional approach here, and how we look at how everything fits together. We've talked about client flow. Ultimately, we're talking about people experiencing homelessness and whether or not they're going to get served and whether or not they get lost. Then the other side to that is how we, the agency, I call it the staff response, is we're still very confused at some level here. And I wanted to point that out, that was what I picked up from yesterday. And then today it's like, this is a contractual entity here. We've got a problem, Houston. That's just my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Bill. We appreciate that. Because we've talked about the lead agency, collaborative applicant, and HMIS, envisioning the roles and responsibility, I want to open up the floor and be sure that Tracy Jackson as the VP of Metro has an opportunity to chime in about those roles and responsibilities in light of what we're discussing today.
Thank you, Angela. I think the presentation encapsulates everything that the lead agency is currently doing and is striving to do. So I think it's an accurate recap of what the lead agency, or the IO now, is doing.
It's funny, I see Bill shaking his head. He's not sold on that IO.
Right.
David, I know you're the HMIS guru in the room. We definitely want to pause and give you an opportunity to chime in as well.
Yeah, so I think of kind of four things pop up to me as I see the presentation here. I guess my summary would be this: it looks like a great synopsis of the HUD, the CFR 578. So thank you, because that is a 40 to 50 page document, and trying to synthesize that into slides is tricky. So hats off, Polly. Thanks, Angela, for making that possible. The first thing I think of is this speaks to the challenge of well staffing the general membership and independent review team, especially when that includes staff at the contracted agencies. When I think about the potential for conflicts of interest, or just who has which roles and responsibilities there. I think in a community that's Flint, Genesee is a smaller community when you think of the 400 plus COC across the states. And so I don't want Bill or Tracy or Angela or Jim or whomever to feel like they've got to themselves represent them across 4 or 5 different kind of committees there. So I think that's the challenge of any mid-sized COC. So just recognizing the intentionality that this requires when it comes to making sure that we got the right people on the right teams, and that they're not feeling like they're exhausted because they're constantly showing up to committees, subcommittees, task force, and work groups. I think it'd be helpful to hear a little bit more about for people who aren't deep in the HUD regs on a daily basis, or at least a weekly basis. Polly, I don't know if you can speak to some of the intentionality behind having designated non-voting seats in the governance councils versus the requirement to abstain in cases of conflict of interest, and the idea of what that looks like to propose an appropriate and knowledgeable representative as well, because that makes I've heard that language. I'm sure many people here have as well, but there's intentionality behind that concept. So if you can kind of unpack that for people who aren't as deep in the regs.
Yes, and maybe I'm ignorant, but I didn't come from the regs. It came from an idea on the committee to make sure that we do have what is in the regs, the representation needed of all the different sectors, and that some of those agencies The group felt they wanted to have on the governance council all the time because they're just key to this. And there were 9 designated seats. We had education, housing, and somebody else that's escaping me at the moment. I have to find it while we talk about something else. And the idea was, though, to have some undesignated seats so that there would be turnover, there would be fresh ideas, there would be opportunities for others to participate. So we put term limits on those other seats so that you might always have a representative from, I'm making this up, law enforcement, but they would be on for this time and then they'd disappear and somebody else would come on from the hospital or whatever. So that you would have people who are in the world of the COC, but who bring something new. And yet you have the legacy, continued experience, wisdom, knowledge of the permanent seats who deal with this day in and day out. So that was sort of the idea. And the same with officers. The charter language also says that no 2 officers should be from the same sector. So you couldn't load up the power, not that there's much power in the executive committee or the officers, but with any one sector or any one agency. So the idea was trying to spread both the ability to sit at the table as well as to get the input at the table that you really need and want.
Sure. And
that
then I
make
think, yeah, and I think also just the idea that the lead agency in its ability to vote or not vote in those matters, and the HMS administrator to be able to vote or not vote in matters at general versus matters that involve a conflict of interest. So I'm not fully taken on with that language as it's proposed, just because I think the LA or IO, if you redefine it, and the system administrator, I think would have to recuse themselves in issues that are a conflict of interest, but in issues that are not, I think you might not only want to have the voice present, but actually have a voting presence on behalf of the people who are influencing and, more importantly, implementing those factors, to be able to say, you're one of X votes, but at least to have that be a vote. And then in conflicts of interest, they would have to abstain, obviously.
That's a great point, David. So I can speak to that historically, right? This community has determined that the lead agency, HMIS, which have been synonymous, but also like all municipalities would not have a vote. They definitely present, definitely have commentary, able to present, but be a non-voting entity. And that's more of a historical tradition in which the community's been really vocal about that.
Okay, so and only serving as a HMS administrator for a year and a half now, I don't have all that historical perspective when it comes to Flint, Genesee specifically. So I think just recognizing that is a community decision, and so affirming and getting out of the way if that's where the community has been leading there, right? But recognizing that isn't a mandate from HUD. It's got to be, that seems like it's the community specific flavor for what this needs to look like for Flint, Genesee specifically.
You bring up a great point, right? Because what Polly has really done is quantify what are the HUD regulations and what are the community nuances, the intention behind the charter, right? Even as we drafted governance, as we walk through these changes in the last several years, has always been that the frontline user, right, that essential worker has voice and choice. And so all of the provisions through any committee, and I want to say this, right? This is a different model, because a lot of times you'll have governance that makes decisions and that's the final say. So we have heard, as we've sat with HUD and different funders and entities, like it's different that the governance actually advises, but the general membership votes for approval. So that is something we've done in our community because we want to be sure that the power lies within the voice of community versus any type of administrative entity.
I think to speak to that, with the HMS lead, HMS administrator specific portions there, I'd also say one of the community nuances that I think is lost here that we could further specify would be when it comes to the data privacy and security standards. that in many other COC, the HMS administrator is the one developing those, and Michigan is unique in having arguably the best state implementation in the country. So as a result of that, I think there is a value in being able to say something to the effect of like the system administrator supports the Michigan statewide implementation in their own data privacy and security standards. Because I think not only do we not want to get in the business of developing our own, but I think there's value in saying we're part of a statewide implementation. I think the first statewide implementation back in 2010. And so I think that would be helpful also just to say that the HMS staff is supporting the statewide infrastructure there. And then I noticed a couple times in the slides itself, I don't know if this comes out in the final version of the document, but my last comment would be just making sure that we've got consistency with at least every 5 years versus every 5 years. I think a lot of the references there were for at least every 5 years, but just recognizing that if the Titanic starts sinking, which again would be very intentional in making sure that that never happens, but you don't want to be beholden to having to wait 5 years. So just making sure it's consistent throughout.
Yes, that is the intent, David, and I'll make sure that it is.
I think it only got missed once, but just making sure. Yep.
I'll take it. Yeah, no, I want to make sure. And I do have a comment on the designated seats, if that's still an interest. We picked 9 designated seats for the draft. The Genesee Intermediate School District, these are all voting seats. The Flint Housing Commission, the Genesee County Planning Commission, the City of Flint, the Genesee County Land Bank, Shelter of Flint, My Brother's Keeper, GCYC, and Carriage Town Ministries. Those are the proposed designated seats. So I raised the question, we were going through it, well, what if one of them folds? And then we just replace them, I guess was sort of the answer. We'd have to tackle that when it happens. And then the designated non-voting seats would be the 3 lead agencies, the lead agency, HMIS and HARA. And it will take back to the work group the idea of making them voting unless there's a conflict of interest.
And I think the importance there, though, of what you're describing, it can be difficult for people to understand because you have to think with a good governance council of the Titanic kind of situations. And so then you're thinking if we're describing here the roles versus like there happens to be My Brother's Keeper or Catholic Charities or Metro or whomever in whatever given spot that exists. That's the way it's always been. That is the way it's going to be for the foreseeable future. But making sure that there is that understanding that, we're describing the world as it exists. We have the flexibility to accommodate a world that might look different, but that you don't have to rewrite the governance council if worst case scenario, a specific agency folds or loses a specific responsibility that they've had.
Yep, I hear you.
That's helpful because I think when we thought through that, it was definitely the Housing Commission because of their role, the Land Bank because of their role, the ISD due to the McKinney-Vento person that's available to support children, and then also the all of the shelters, right? All of the participating shelters. So maybe stating it like that, but there could be provision for that number to move if, let's say, 2 new shelters were created in the next year or somewhat. Right.
And the language, the way in which I've seen other COC's governance charters describe this has been either something to the effect of like Catholic Charities, comma, in their role as the current HARA, comma, but that's still anchoring it to the specific agency versus the role. So I think the better way to, more progressive COCs would say the HARA or the lead agency, comma, this agency currently, and then moving forward. So you're anchoring it to the role versus the exact organization, but at least parsing those. I think there's value in doing that in the governance charter itself.
I think we did that with the contracted entities. It just says HARA. It doesn't say Catholic Charities anywhere, but for the other ones, there was a desire to make it more specific. And the model we use, and Kirk's not on the phone, but the Greater Flint Health Coalition has had this, and I know I worked there. I was the first executive director 100 years ago, and they kept those. It was really important to them, and they still have them, although they revise their charter all the time. So I don't know all what their thinking is anymore, but we could just say 4 representatives of the housing sector, but there was some desire to make it specific. So we need to revisit that, I think.
Bill's had his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Bill.
Thank you. I was on mute. The concern that I have, and I think this is going to be very important here, we place a lot of emphasis on the role of the general membership. And we know when we go to meetings, we get people in and out from, or maybe they're at their meeting for the first or second time. We need to be really clear, and maybe this is something I'm going to suggest in the parking lot, so to speak, that we need to do some training, quote, membership training about their role. We're placing a lot of emphasis here on the membership to make decisions, to give final approval. I really, again, I will say this again, there needs to be some training of the general membership. It can't be this amorphous group that shows up not every now and then. So
And I think that's one of the things we did, Bill. We felt the same way because it's messy when you just have a collaborative and not a governing body and not, usual nonprofit structure. But so we spent a lot of time on what's in a member in good standing who can vote. Anybody can come and listen, but if you're going to vote, you have to be a member in good standing. And we define that as somebody who attends 9 out of 12 meetings, so they're at least active. We also were clear, and we talked about this in the previous chat, about if you're an individual member or an organizational member.
Yeah.
And we tried to be really clear, and there was some pushback, but if there's an organizational member, they have to designate their voting member, who's their representative, and they can have an alternate if that person can't come. And the lead agency has to know who that is. They have to be on the list of people who can vote on the roll call, and that might change as people change, but we have to keep up with that. So we know the people voting, have some standing in their organization and come and listen at meetings. So that's the risk of a membership organization versus a directorship, but that's what we got.
And
The other
just to
comment that I wanted to
co-sign,
make.
but Bill, just 2 other points to clarify, carrying over from the chat about the membership. This is the first time members will have to complete a form. This is the first time members will have to complete a conflict of interest. And that will be an annual process. To your point, David, right? Really determining that conflict of interest policy, that it's annual, that it's reviewed. It does put the burden on the lead agency, right? To not only collect attendance and monitor participation in committees for voting eligibility, but also to say, has this entity identified if it's organizational or individual? Have they then followed the steps of completing the conflict of interest? Because all of those will be prerequisites for voting. And I think you're right, Bill. I think that we always have an opportunity to continue to enhance the training of both the general membership, but also of committee members as we look to grow as a COC.
I was going to come back to that, to the point about, yes, we have the HUD rules. Yes, we have all the structure that we want to set up. Keep in mind, it's a response. HUD it took a long time for HUD to mandate a COC. The COC came about as an organic process of saying, we've had so many individual entities competing with each other. The COC says, the whole idea behind it is we're going to talk more about how we're going to spend these dollars because they're limited. Okay, so I think the process here is how we respond to this as a community is the key thing here. It's about community response. It's about our response. And it's something that's unique to Genesee County and the city of Flint. And we need to be really aware of that. And we need to step up to meet that challenge every year. Every time we serve people out in the community. That's just my perspective on where we're at with all of this. I think the work that you folks have done has been very, very complimentary here. There's been a lot of thought going on here. You can see it. It's been very positive. But I wanted to be sure it's because we're responding like a staff attitude to when our community is also our clients and our consumers are saying, hey, look, this is what we're experiencing. How are you going to respond to this? And I think we need to think about that a lot. But thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, and I want to say with my consulting hat on, well, I try to be as accommodating to what the community group wants. I really share David's concern about capacity, because I see the same 6 or 7 or 8 people at every meeting who have full-time jobs, that aren't this. And they're spending lots and lots of time. And I don't know what happens if they change jobs, or if they just say, I'm done, or there's burnout, or, whatever. But so, I'm still toying in the back of my mind, although I don't think anybody in the group is, but, should you incorporate as a nonprofit or hire staff or something? I mean, I don't know what the right solution is, but I think that has to be constantly monitored, because you're going to burn out really good people and you're going to lose their institutional memory. And if there's no structure to capture that, I have concerns. But there's my 2 cents.
And I think that's happened, Polly, right? I would say over the last 10 years, we've definitely burned through people because we haven't created a system to work smarter instead of harder. And right, so a lot of this burden rests on an individual in an organization. And when their life changes or they're no longer there, we've seen systems fail, right? We've seen a response that's been challenged. So great conversation, everyone. Are there any closing thoughts, comments, or suggestions? This is a safe space to critique, provide feedback, share ideas. We are open and ready for it. None of this is well, it's in ink, right? But we can, these documents are living and they're meant for us to collaborate and build this together.
I have a question. So where do I fit in this rubric?
Everywhere.
What do you mean? You're on the governance council.
I guess when we talk about agencies and organizations, for what I provide, what is, my purpose.
Well, go ahead. Well, I think, Sharice, you're like all of the other, I don't know, there's 60 or 70 agencies probably represented. And other than the designated agencies, which are education, housing, and government, we want to have a place for everybody to have a voice. And so on the general membership, for sure, on committees, for sure, and on the governance council, which will be rotating every 3 to 6 years, depending on how much time and capacity they have to commit to it. You're currently on the governance council. You'll continue on the governance council. And we always need people who may come and go, who can represent people who have experienced homelessness or are in danger of experiencing homelessness. So all of you fit that bill. I mean, either you have personally or you represent people who do. So I think anywhere and everywhere. Does that make any sense?
I don't
Thank
see a place you don't fit. That's just is my take. Like, we're always, and there's so many initiatives that come up. We see opportunity every day, right? And it's really finding the committee or finding the table where we're addressing not just what is, but what could be. And that's what we put our hand to the plow on.
If you have any ideas, we're open. Tell us. We'll put you someplace.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Angela. Thanks, Polly. I just needed to kind of know, because my roles and organizations are kind of changing too. So, spending time and being here is very important to me, because I want to be a part of the process and I want to see this come to fruition. But I just need to know how, more what can I give, or, just where I need to be. That's all. But I'm figuring it
I think
out.
your question helps us though, Polly, like when we're presenting and talking through the COC, right? There is so much work. When you talk about burnout, right? It's really, how do we enlist and harness the power of that, larger COC table so people see themselves in the work? And we need to make that process easy and make that access open. I see your
Yes.
hand, Bill.
One quick comment about these kinds of conversations. I'm reminded from too many years ago, giving my age away, of the Latin phrase, nihil obstat. Let nothing stand in the way. And that's the whole idea. As we keep debating and having these conversations, let no thing stand in the way, because that's kind of what we're all about here. And to echo Sharice's role here, you've been very important as a part of the conversation. Wherever we've been, you've been there. I consider that a very important role, a VIP role, just so that you know that. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you, folks.
Well, and there are others, maybe like you, Sharice, other organizations that aren't quote unquote shelters, but are essential to taking care of our community. So, yeah, I can think of a million places to put you. I just don't know where you want to be. But I hear your point, Angela, too, about making that really clear to people.
Well, thank you, everyone. We're really mindful of the time. We're heading up on the hour here. Are there any final thoughts or questions? I leave you with a general reminder. Our next session is next Friday, same bat time, same bat channel. You are welcome to join us with the same Zoom link. And we look forward to, again, I want to lift up the fact that Polly's information is readily available. If you have a comment or suggestion and you just haven't been comfortable sharing it verbally, please reach out anonymously. You can reach out via email or give her a phone call. She's easy to work with, and she'll keep your confidence if you'd like to do it that way. Or any of the EC members are available as well. Thank you for your time today. I hope your Friday is amazing. Anything else, Polly?
Yeah, I just going to say that the next step in the process after we get through these charts, we'll be revising the draft we have now. So it'll be another draft, and you will get that whole thing if you choose to read it. If you're in the Insomniac or anything, you'll want to. So there will be another version coming out that hopefully addresses what we've heard here, and it's still not too late. I mean, it's ultimately going to still go to the general membership. So our hope here is just to bubble up any concerns or questions or anything we've missed or things you don't agree with, because the point is to get it right now if we can. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Stay safe.
care,
Stay
y'all.
safe all, and thank you.
Thank you.